For Lecture 8, we'll be looking at listening. And again, we have another quote here which says, "I know that you believe you understand what you think I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant." Now, it's a bit of a convoluted quote and somewhat hard to understand if you read it real fast. If you really think about it, you have probably found yourself in this situation at some point in time. You know, you have interpreted or misinterpreted something someone has said, or vice versa, and it causes an escalated argument, conflict, something of that nature. And if you had this conversation via text message or Facebook post or any other computer-mediated communication, you've probably found those experiences tenfold compared to the face-to-face. So we're going to look at listening and what it all entails. Now, did you know that less than 2% of the population has had any formal educational experience with listening? Now, that was as of 1983, which was obviously an extremely long time ago. And it has gotten better, not astronomically better, but it has gotten a little bit better now that people have noticed that listening skills are absolutely vital in all circumstances, not just personal, interpersonal relationships, but also in large group settings, in formal business communication, and all kinds of areas. We've even gotten to the point where people are starting to be trained in digital listening, believe it or not. So the ability to accurately interpret and understand and provide feedback to messages that are presented digitally. So even though taking this as a pretty standard number, a pretty decent number, I wouldn't go much past 7 or 8%. But if we take this number of 2% of the population that has had any formal educational experience, so any training in the ability and tasks related to listening, and think about this next part. So as much as 80% of the information we obtain is the result of listening. So most of what we receive, most of what we take in via listening. Adults in the United States listen at only really about 25% efficiency, meaning that they are preoccupied, distracted, and forgetful nearly 75% of the time. So only 25% of your time is spent effectively and efficiently listening, while 75% of the time, and I'm sure it's gotten even worse nowadays, but 75% of the time life is throwing its curveballs and making it even harder for you to catch the information. So here's a couple of other interesting statistics. Immediately after we listen to someone, we can only recall about 50% of what was said. So this is immediately. The second somebody says something, immediately when they finish, you can actually typically only recall about 50% of what they said. Now, spoken words only account for about 30 to 35% of that meaning. So the rest is actually transmitted through nonverbal communication that can really only be detected through the visual and auditory listening. So going back to the 50%, you may have obtained 50% of what that person said. And yes, you may be able to literally regurgitate word for word what they said. Well, even if you can do that, you've only gotten 30 to 35% of the message. So you still have another 15 to 20% to go to even reach your 50%. So you are obtaining the nonverbals. You're only grasping about 15 to 20% minimum of nonverbals. So really, if you think about it, there's so much that we're missing. And more than 35 business studies over a large period of time have indicated that listening is a top skill needed for success in the business field. And even though this is a later date of a study, this article, this source is a very strong source, but even though these are later dates, so these are quite a few years ago, the studies have only gotten more prevalent. So there's only a higher need for the ability to listen and communicate effectively in all aspects of business and interpersonal relationships. Now, people with less confidence in themselves tend to be better listeners for the emotional meaning of a spoken message. It's a sensitivity issue. So people with less confidence in themselves, they tend to be a little bit better at understanding what's behind the words, or what depth is connected to the words or the tone of the message. Now again, this may sound a little disjointed, but I'm just giving you some facts here, some statistics. Another one is that being more willing to communicate and less apprehensive about listening and speaking is actually an indicator of better listening comprehension. So the more willing you are to communicate, the more willing you are to listen and to speak with others without nerves, the better your listening skills. There's just a correlation there. So the study took some data and they looked to see if there was any correlation between those that were willing and non-apprehensive about communication and those with good listening skills. And there was a correlation. They rose together. Those numbers rose together. And then finally, one last little interesting statistic is the most frequently reported listening barriers among students are listening primarily for details or facts. So all you're listening to you're only focusing on the details, only focusing on the facts, becoming distracted by noise. And as you remember from previous lecture, noise is all sorts of things, not just somebody banging on a pot. It's all kinds of, quote, noise, physiological, psychological, and so on. Another is daydreaming or becoming preoccupied with something else while listening, and then also thinking of another topic or detouring because of what the speaker has said. And then finally, one of the last things, and probably my biggest factor, is a lack of interest in the speaker's subject. So when somebody starts going off on a topic that I'm not that interested in, I have a hard time staying focused and really taking in the details. I've gotten better over time, but it is difficult. So these are just a few little interesting statistics that you might take to note. Now here we have some basic notes for the idea of listening and what it entails. So we have a couple of quotes here, and one says, or a couple of sayings here, and one says, listening is easy. All you have to do is hear what the person is saying, right? Actually wrong. One of the most commonly misunderstood and underassessed communication skills would be listening. Listening is not purely a physical trait. It is a process. It's not just hearing. It's actually proceeding through the steps to a true understanding. So often when one is thinking about listening, they're actually considering only that very first step, and that is the hearing of the information. But when we listen, or at least effectively listen, we start with the very basics and proceed forward. So here is the step-by-step process of listening. Number 1, hearing. Number 2, attending, followed by 3, understanding that information, then responding, then remembering. So we have to go through all of these in order to complete the full listening process. And as you can imagine, it is difficult to go through the whole process without making mistakes. I mean, it's a very detailed process. You have 5 different steps that you have to follow through, and oftentimes subconsciously. So you have to go through these steps, and it can be quite difficult. Now let's look at each of the steps and how they can impact that listening process. So let's start with step 1. Step 1 is the hearing step. Now the first step in the listening process is the one we often think of as the only step, and that's hearing. We think of hearing as all audible information. We often think it's what audibly goes into our ears. You know, a friend is telling you about their day, a professor is lecturing, or a loved one is venting, and we hear those words. But is that all there is to that first stage? No. There is much more to that first stage of hearing than many of us think. One important thing to ask yourself is, can I hear or only hear with my ears? It sounds kind of funny, and I know when I first heard this I thought, what? Yeah, obviously you can only hear with your ears. But in the hearing stage, we actually can hear through both our eyes and our ears. Through our ears being the auditory, and through our eyes being some of those nonverbal things. So let me give you an example. Consider for a moment a situation in which your friend is telling you about her day. She goes through the motions, mentioning the various events that happened during school and at home. When she gets to a point in her story about a conversation she had with her mom, she only mentions that it was a short conversation. However, you can tell by her facial expressions and the way she's clenching her fists that there is more to that story than she's saying. So in this case, you are hearing information through the viewing of her nonverbal communication. So in this example, it's kind of easy to see how there is much more to the hearing stage than many think. But there's one more thing to consider when thinking about hearing. Not only do you see and hear information provided through words and nonverbals, but you also receive information that is omitted. Let's just make this more complicated. So not only are you hearing things and seeing things and interpreting that information, but you're also receiving and interpreting information that is omitted. And in this stage, all it is the receiving of that information. So you are seeing or hearing stuff that's not there. I know it sounds strange, but go with me on this. So in a sense, we see not only what information is provided, but in some cases we see information that is completely left out. So let me give you another example. Your loved one is venting to you about an argument he had with his boss. He proceeds to tell you that his boss is a jerk and removed him from a project he was working on. He continues to rant about how much he dislikes his boss. In the process of his venting, you notice he never mentioned why the boss removed him from the project. This omission could tell you a few things. One, maybe he just doesn't want to talk about it. Or two, maybe he is so mad that he forgot to mention that part. Or three, maybe there was a viable reason the boss had for removing him from the project, and your loved one is upset or even embarrassed about it. Just the omission of that information can cause you to consider a realm of information that your loved one never provided, verbally or non-verbally. So now we can see that there is so much more to the hearing stage of listening than maybe we first realized. Just think, hearing is only the first stage in the listening process. Let's go on to the second. And people think listening is so easy. All right, let's look at attending. Now, I want you to ignore these pictures for a second and just listen to me here. Once your body has completed the physical process of hearing information, you have to decide what to attend to. So attending is the psychological process of selecting what gets through when bombarded with information. Now remember, we said earlier that only 50% of what someone says can be automatically retrieved shortly after the saying or after the statements. So we have to choose what we listen to. We select or, quote, attend to that information. So how do we decide what to attend to and what to ignore? Now, our personal needs, our wants, and our desires can influence what we choose to attend to first. So check this out. Look at these photos here. Look at all these pictures and just glance at them real quick. Which of those pictures stick out to you the most? Well, for me, it was the dog and the teacher. And where's the teacher? Here he is. So here's the dog and the teacher. Those were the two things that really stuck out to me the most. Now, my personal experience as a teacher and my love for animals, especially dogs, this cute little boxer here, is what caused me to zero in on those two pictures. So once you've chosen which of those to focus on, you begin to listen to the details of that message. So once I have decided that of all this detailed messages, I'm going to focus on these two things, my brain just automatically goes to these two things. Now maybe I just finished watching a football game. So when I look at this, I automatically focus on this image here. It just really depends on where your focus lies. But once you have that, you can go look at a closer message. So maybe you picked this one. If you picked this image up here, let's look at it a little bit closer. Let's take a closer look at what is in the image. What sort of things do you see in the picture now that you are attending to it? I mean, really think about it. You automatically just jumped up here and saw these images. But once you focus in, once you look really closely, I mean, I can decide, well, is this dog underweight? Is it overweight? What is this teacher teaching? And what's in his hand? Those are the things that I can start to zone in on, to attend to. On this one here, you see a guy playing a guitar with fire in the background. That was my initial gut instinct, the first thing I saw when I was looking at this picture up here. But when you get closer, you will notice a skull down here at the bottom, a couple of images of ladies up here, some splash paint in the back, and a variety of other little tiny things. But these are the things that are kind of somewhat hidden if you're not really paying attention in that first initial reaction, initial step. So it doesn't stop there though. I mean, we have heard the message, We've attended to the message. Now we're going to take the next step and we are going to understand the message. Now I know you're looking at this and you're going, yes, I love this video clip, because most people think this is the best video clip. But honestly, it fits perfectly with this section here. True understanding occurs when we make sense of a message. It sounds easy, right? I mean, how can you not understand simple words? What can interfere with our understanding? Let's see what might be interfering with the understanding of this clip below. So if you have access to this clip, go ahead and watch it. You can search it on YouTube, or you can just look it up in a text-based version of this lecture, depending upon the class, and see what you find. And now that you're back, or later on when you get a chance to go take a look at it, how can we make sure that we understand information clearly and accurately, even when someone has a bit of an accent or we perceive them to not speak the same language we are speaking? So what can we do? One, we can avoid assumptions and prejudging. So we can avoid assuming things and prejudging those that we don't really know too well, adding in those stereotypes. Number two, we can relate the information to our personal experiences. We don't want to leave it at that. Honestly, that's a great tool, but you don't want to leave it there, because if all you do is relate to your personal experiences, you are going to be missing out on a great deal of information. Another couple of things you can do is ask questions and paraphrase. One of the best tools I have seen in my experiences is the Socratic method. And if you know what the Socratic method is, you know exactly what I'm getting at. If not, very briefly, the Socratic method is questioning. So you, instead of stating what you think, and in some cases paraphrasing, instead of doing that, you are asking questions and getting responses. So when you don't understand something, you don't say, so you're saying such and such. Instead, you say, what about this? Or can you tell me more about that? Or why did you choose to go this direction? So asking those questions help not only for you to clarify the information, but for the person to really see what information they're putting out there. So once you fully understand someone, then you have to move on to the next step, which is responding. So we've heard the message in a variety of ways. We've chosen what to attend to. And now we are finishing the point in which we are understanding what we were attending to. We're getting the details. And then we're going to go to our next step, and that is responding. So when we choose to respond to information, we're generating some kind of feedback or a reaction that lets others know that you have received and understood their message. So this consists of giving the speaker very observable feedback. Most often there are two ways in which we handle responding. This is through active, or being an active participant in the conversation, and passive, listening without responding correctly or pretending to listen. So you can either have active or passive listening. Obviously, active listening is what we want, but occasionally we find ourselves using passive listening. So we, sure, yep, you know, all that stuff when it didn't actually happen. A great clip from this is in the text-based version of this lecture, as well as in a YouTube search. If you want to take a chance, you can just copy and paste on any of these. You can always just copy and paste this into a YouTube search engine, and you'll find exactly what you're looking for. And it's from a episode of a season of Yesteryear, which is an older show, but it's quite funny in some instances. And it's a very, very observable instance of passive listening. So take a look at it if you get a chance. Now, how do we make sure that we use active listening when responding rather than passive? Now, here's a couple of things to do, and you kind of have to use multiple versions of this. Now, here's a big thing with active listening. When people think of active, they think of just talking back and forth. And while that is applicable, consider this. If I were to say to you, hey, I'm an active person, what would you think? How would you interpret what I just said? When I say I'm an active person, I mean that I'm physically active, right? Maybe I run, maybe I lift weights, maybe I play a sport. I'm an active person. Translate that over into listening. If I say I'm an active listener, I mean I am physically involved in the listening process. In order to do that, I use certain cues. And some of those cues are verbal, like here we have this idea of using support cues like back channeling cues. And that's where you say things like, huh, yeah, oh, I see. However, those can be kind of deceiving. In some cases, people do those without even realizing it. It also means nodding your head, leaning forward, maintaining eye contact. Those are all physically involving cues that signal to the person that you are actively listening to what they say. So, using all those back channeling cues or those physical cues, also be very honest, straightforward, not brutally honest, although in some cases that is appropriate, but in most cases it's not. So be straightforward, be honest with how you feel, not how they make you feel. So be honest about things, own your responses. So that means use I language. I feel blank, or I think blank, not you always blank, or you never blank. Those are things that do not own our own responses, and it's a bit childish to do. So you want to avoid that as an adult. So own your responses and resist always trying to solve the problem. In many cases, it's not necessary. I know this is a big argument between men and women, but really, it's not even just that. There are many cases when people will want you to solve the problem. And honestly, there's a key to that. If you want to know whether it's an instance in which you are supposed to offer advice and solutions versus an instance in which somebody just needs verbal, emotional, and physical support, what you need to look for is a question. Look for the person speaking to ask you a question. Now, the question could be literally, what should I do? Or it could be, can you believe she said that? Those are typically keys to allow you to open the door to solve a problem, or to at least offer a soft solution. If somebody asks you a question, you can answer that question with potential solutions. If you're going to go back to the stereotype that guys always want to solve the problem and girls want somebody to listen to them, if you find yourself in that situation, and it's not universal, but if you find yourself there, just wait for the question. When the question comes in, attempt to help with the solution, and if that seems to backfire, then step back and just offer support. That once we have gotten through all of these things, and we've gotten through those first 4 steps, and we've engaged in active listening, we can move to our final step of the listening process, which is remembering. Now, remembering is purely this: recalling information. So think about how you remember some of the following things. If you're listening to a teacher lecture, what do you do in order to recall that information? Do you take notes? Do you record it and play it back? What kind of memory do you have? Do you attain things audibly? Do you obtain things by touching and actively participating in them? Or do you obtain things by visually seeing them, or a combination of those? If you are trying to get directions to somebody's house, do you want people to say, hey, go left, right, north, south, east, that kind of thing? Or do you want them to say, go all the way down the street until you see the Walmart and turn left? So it depends on your personality. When you're listening to a speech, or even when you're preparing for a speech as well, but usually when you're listening and you're trying to remember it, do you outline what they said? Do you write it down word for word? Do you rehearse your speech out loud? What do you do in order to make sure you remember it effectively? So remembering sounds fairly simple. It sounds like an easy thing to do, but however, our ability to recall information is kind of a sketchy one. So let's look at some of these stats. The ability to recall information. Now remember back when we said earlier that 50% of what we hear immediately after hearing it is recalled. So only 50% immediately is recalled. Now let's say you listen to a lecture at noon. At 8 o'clock, you're only going to remember about 35% of what was said. And you listen to that same lecture and you get to a month later or a couple months later, you're only going to remember about 25% of what was said, if that. That's kind of the max. So is remembering really that difficult? Is it as hard as we think? Well, let's do an activity. I'm going to give you a list of words. I want you to listen to the list of words only once, and then turn away from the screen and write down as many of the words as you can remember. So try to get as many as you can. Ready? Okay, here's the list. I'm going to put it up here and then I'll take it away. Here we go. Bed, rest, wake, tired, dream, awake, night, eat, comfort, sound, slumber, snore. Okay? Please write down as many as you can think of in 30 seconds. Go. About 15 seconds left. Okay, stop and see what you wrote down here. Now I've got the list here, but I'm going to ask you to think about this list a little bit. What did you have? How many of them did you put on there correctly? Was it difficult to remember these? I mean, you've got a large list of words here. How many of these did you get, and how many were correct? Now, one more thought-provoking question. Did you write down the word sleep on your list? If you did, you are not alone. At least 50% of the people that take this test will put down the word sleep when trying to recall this list. And if you look, sleep is not on here anywhere. Now, why do you think that is? Do you think that it's kind of a result of association? We associate sleep with all these things listed above, and therefore we, quote, remember it even though it was never said. So how does this apply to our interpersonal relationships? Well, think about it. When we listen to others, we associate their behavior, reactions, and feelings with certain things because, quote, that's how we would feel or react. So therefore, we may actually run the risk of projecting these feelings or reactions onto those we have relationships with just because we associate them with the circumstance. So how do we make sure that we remember things that actually happened and not stuff that we just associate with the message? Here are a couple of tips. One, identify main ideas in what someone is saying. And that's really easy to do if you're listening to a lecture or to a formal speech. Not as easy with an interpersonal relationship. But try to get the bullet points, the big stuff. Also, summarize back to the person what you just heard when there's a breath, when there's breathing room. And then repeat what they said and what you said if it's necessary. That's kind of the last thing that you would need to do. But these are some things that you can do in order to be as effective as possible with your listening. And there are other tools, obviously. So finally, we all know what it's like not to be listened to, honestly, but do you know whether you are actually a good listener or not? We've got this quiz, and if you go to psychtest.com, or there's a link here in some, it depends on which version of this you're looking at, but there is a link in the text version of this. But also on psychtest.com, you can go and check out this quiz, and be sure to agree that you are using this for personal purposes only, because it's a free abridged version of a longer, more involved study. So it only has 15 questions. It's not the most accurate thing in the world, but it's not too bad. And upon completion, you'll receive a score and an interpretation of that score, which will give you a lot of great detail. So check it out and let me know what you think, and we will see you next time with lecture number 9.